Good day, everyone. Welcome for today's Advocata event. This is a conversation that I will be having with Dr. Narayan, who has kindly accepted from India. You will better understand his background when I ask him to tell us a little bit about his experiences and his career. So we are going to discuss today about India's fuel pricing and taxation experience. Maybe there are a few lessons for us in Sri Lanka to take away. As most of you would already be aware that this has become a very topical subject after the recent increases in domestic retail prices on petrol, which was something like 20 rupees, and on diesel by 7 rupees. But before we get into this subject, I thought that it is the best interest of the audience, who perhaps may not all be technical people, to give you a short introduction to the issues, the economic thinking behind fuel taxes. So I prepared a short presentation that hopefully will take less than 15 minutes, and then we can have a conversation with Dr. Narayan, which we are planning to be around 1 hour. I have prepared some contextual questions to ask him, but Advocata is also taking in questions from the audience, which will be curated and forwarded to me, which I will be discussing with Dr. Narayan. So let me first get started with the presentation. The first slide shows you the context of how large is fuel imports to the country. And the graph on the left-hand side shows you the total value of goods imports. So this is not including service imports. And last year, because it was pandemic affected year, there was a significant reduction in imports. But generally, you can assume that we import about $20 billion worth of goods. And fuel imports, depending on the price and the consumption in any given year, the gross value is about $4 billion. And we also export about $500 million worth of fuel, mainly in the form of aviation fuel at the airport, and in terms of bunkering fuel that is put in ships. On the right shows you how large fuel imports are as a percentage of GDP. And it's a sizable thing. Of course, it is an imported item, but it gives you a context. It's about 4 to 4.5% of GDP. Next. So let's get into some definitions. Very briefly, the concept of an externality, what does that mean? So economists define an externality is the result of an individual's, household's or firm's decision to consume, produce or invest that is imposed on an unrelated third party. Externalities can be positive or negative and can also be borne privately, an individual or organization or socially borne by society. So what is a corrective tax? A corrective tax is a market-based policy option used by the government to address negative externalities. The tax adjusts the cost of production of the good and service that is creating the externality. This discourages the production and consumption of a good and service. Next. So what is a subsidy? A benefit given to an individual, business or institution in the form of a cash payment or tax reduction granted by the government. It is generally given to reduce the cost of providing a good or service that creates positive externality, as it is the overall interest of the public. And what is a tax subsidy? This refers to the reduction in the tax burden borne by producers of goods and services that generate a positive externality to society. It is a benefit awarded by the government to provide an economic incentive to produce. So a corrective tax is an instrument that is used to address a negative externality. A tax subsidy is an instrument that is used to promote a positive externality. So what did the World Bank have to say about tax subsidies, which is what we currently have for fuel? And I will explain that. The non-poor are the largest consumers of fuel and electricity. The top 30% of society consumes 70% of fuel. well ahead of direct and indirect consumption of fuel by the bottom 40% through the use of public transport. So, direct consumption is people who have vehicles and who will directly buy fuel for their vehicles, personal vehicles. Indirect are those people who use public transportation which requires fuel. The administered fuel prices are an effective subsidy to the non-poor funded indirectly by fiscal resources. This is a statement that the World Bank made in one of their publications a few years back. Next. So, how does our prices compare to the region? Let's have a look at this comparative table of countries in the SAARC region. Next. So, the column on the left hand side shows you the comparative sets per capita income, and you can see Sri Lanka last year, the per capita which used to hover around 4,000 has gone down because the economy contracted and the currency also depreciated. It's at about close to 3,700. India is close to about 2,000, which is, you can assume, perhaps 45% less than ours. Pakistan is even lower at 1,260. Bangladesh, which has been making headlines recently, has slightly overtaken India, closer to 2,000, and Nepal a lot less. The next is the rupee equivalent of fuel prices in these different countries. And Sri Lanka is in purple, and you can see petrol at 157, diesel and kerosene. Have a look at India. The equivalent rupee equivalent price is 260 for petrol, and diesel 236 and kerosene 87. The price is not constant all over India. In Bombay, probably it has the highest taxes, and therefore the fuel retail price is a little bit higher than the Delhi price. And the columns that say relative is an analysis relative to our Sri Lankan prices, how our regional neighbors are priced. So, you can see that except for Pakistan in petrol, in every other category, our regional neighbors price fuel at a significant premium to us. You also note that they are significantly poorer than us. And the last column is relative price of petrol and diesel, which is the ratio between the price of petrol and price of diesel. So, in Sri Lanka, the price of petrol is 41% higher than the price of diesel. Now, at the refinery level, actually the price of diesel is slightly higher than the price of petrol. It's almost the same, but there's a slight price premium which changes with market conditions. But we have chosen to differentiate between the pricing, perhaps with the notion that diesel is the poor man's fuel. And with Dr. Narayan, we will get his input of how India thinks about diesel prices. And you can see that in India, the differential is only 10%. Right. In Pakistan, actually, it's the reverse, that diesel is priced at a price slightly higher than petrol. Bangladesh's differential is similar to Sri Lanka, although the absolute levels are higher, and Nepal also the gap is a lot lower. Next slide. So, how does prices compare over time? Next. So, this graph, which is a time series analysis, shows you the prices of the two petrol variants, octane 92 and 95, which are the time series on the top. And then it shows you the prices of diesel, which is at the bottom. And you can see that there has been change, but over a period of time, it has been stagnant. And the recent price change was the first price change at the retail level after 20 months. Next. This basically shows you the price of petrol and diesel adjusted for inflation over 20 years. And you can see that if you take the starting point back in June 2004, which is probably about 17 years before, the price has been pretty constant, adjusted for inflation. And fuel has an impact on the inflation index also. but not adjusting for that, you can see that the prices basically have remained constant over 17 years. Now, there is fundamentally something wrong with this, because all prices should be adjusting for inflation. Next. So, this is a table which I do not expect you to follow on the screen, because it has a lot of text. We will be making available these slides later, which you can go through, and it shows you an approximation of what Sri Lanka's fuel pricing formula is. A few data points are worthy of noting. Number 5, landed cost. It's about 101 rupees for petrol and about 100 rupees and 28 cents for diesel, pretty much the same. And in this case, petrol price is slightly higher than the diesel price. Then you have all the taxes that are applied to petrol and diesel, and it's a roughly about close to 40 rupees on petrol, and it's about 13.5 rupees on diesel. You could also note that point number 8, there is something called a duty waiver. So, there is customs duty of 50 rupees on petrol and 25 rupees on diesel, but there are waivers, there are discounts, and that is how the tax is reduced. Then you have a whole bunch of processing and storage charges, which is about 5 rupees 50 and 385 for diesel. And then you get the final pump price of the dealer commission. For petrol, it's 157, and for diesel, it's 111. But the cost for petrol is slightly lower, so there's a profit of 4 rupees 31. And for diesel, it's a loss of 12.5 rupees. So, even after the 7 rupee price increase recently, as per our estimates, if you import diesel, you are selling it at a loss. Next. For comparative purposes, we have shown a pricing formula for India. And note the taxes. So, the price of petrol and diesel landed price, because they have a lot of refineries. So, presuming that they produce most of their petrol and diesel from crude, is around 95 Sri Lankan rupees, and our cost was closer to 100, slightly higher than 100. And then after processing, their cost is about 105 versus 110. And if you take the total taxes, number 8, so they have two forms of tax, excise duty and the VAT. So, excise duty is about 88 Sri Lankan rupees, and they have additional VAT, which is number 11, which is 60 rupees for petrol and 34 rupees for diesel. So, you add the two, you will probably get a figure for petrol closer to 148 rupees, and for diesel, you will get a price which is close to 120 Sri Lankan rupees. So, our tax as a comparison is about 1350 for diesel, while in India the comparative figure is 120, and for petrol our total tax was about 39 rupees, while in India the tax is 148. And the final retail price at 263 and diesel 237 is significantly higher than our prices. Next. So, this graph shows you what prices have been over a period of time, and on the right hand side shows you the volumes. This is for petrol, and volumes have gone down in 2020 because of the pandemic. But you can see that there has been a growth previously. And on the left hand side, you can see the selling price and the total cost. And the dotted line basically is the cost curve. And you can see that many a times that, sometimes it's at a profit, but many a times it's at a loss. And the second series of lines is the landed cost and the taxes. And you can see how the taxes keep going up and down. Next. This is an analysis of diesel, and similar to petrol, you can see that in many instances the total cost is significantly higher than the selling price. So, diesel has been priced at a loss. Petrol, most times there's a slight profit. Next. So, this is an analysis of how we tax fuel. So, what are the taxes that are placed on fuel? So, there is customs duty of 50. This is as it stands for petrol, and for diesel it is about 25. Then there are duty waivers. So, you have a net customs duty for petrol of only 5 rupees and for diesel nothing. There is a PAL of 7.5% each, which comes to about 7 rupees 60. And then there is an excise duty, which is a production tax, which is about 27 for petrol and 6. And you add all of this, you will get about 39.6 for petrol and 13 rupees and 50 for diesel. What we call refined petrol and refined diesel is what our national oil company Ceylon Petroleum Corporation refines. And on crude oil, there is no customs duty. They have to pay a similar excise duty, and there is a lower rate of PAL. So, we did an estimate that if you bring in crude oil and refine it, what would be the total taxes? And that is significantly lower. So, on petrol, if you just assume that it is 40, if it is refined petrol, it is 30. And on diesel, if you assume that it is 1350, the refined diesel is about 775. The IMF back in 2010 did an analysis for what are called corrective taxes. And what are these corrective taxes? So, they are carbon emissions, there are congestions on the road, accidents, because we have a large number of personal vehicles, noise and road damage, etc. And India basically, they have estimated the corrective taxes at about 78 cents. In Sri Lanka, it is about 54 cents. I'm sorry, for diesel it is 54 cents, but in Sri Lanka it is lower at 63 cents and 42 cents US cents, which is equivalent to about 84 for diesel and 126 for petrol. Next. So, this was an analysis of at the current status quo, if we continue, because diesel is sold at a loss, it will cost us 26.7 billion a year, and on petrol there will be a small profit of 7.2 billion. The profit on petrol cannot offset the profit on diesel. Next. This shows you a summary of Ceylon Petroleum Corporation's financials up to 2018, because we do not have the figures for 2019 and 20. And it shows you basically that in the year 2018, there was a huge loss, something like 105 million, out of which about 80 billion was due to foreign exchange loss. So, how can the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation have a large foreign exchange loss? The problem is, if you look at the liabilities, they have borrowings in dollars. So, they have like $1 billion borrowed from the People's Bank, and they have another $1 billion borrowed from the Bank of Ceylon, and about $1.2 billion as of now, which are trade creditors, which is oil that we have bought on credit. So, whenever the currency depreciates, you get a huge exchange loss. Next. So, this is just an analysis of how we tax fuel. And if you look at petrol and diesel, about 26% of the price that you buy petrol at is taxes. An equivalent figure in India is about 52%. And for diesel, it is about 11%. It is actually a lot lower because we are selling it at a loss. So, we sell it at a loss of 12.5 rupees, while the taxes are 13.5. Of course, for CPC, the taxes are a little bit lower at about 775 for diesel, because they are refining it, some part of it they are refining it from crude. And then the other columns are what would have been if normal duties were imposed, and you can see that that means that there is normal duty of 15%, VAT of 8 and a PAL of 10. In petrol, the taxation is slightly higher than what you would tax other imported products, and in the case of diesel, it is significantly lower than how you would tax every other imported product. And the last column is that if you impose all the corrective taxes, instead of taxing petrol at 40 rupees, if you tax the externalities, the total taxation should be 160 rupees. And in the case of diesel, instead of taxing it at 13.5 rupees, it should be closer to 119 rupees. Next. And this shows you a summary side of Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, who benefits with a tax subsidy of about 6 billion because of the lower taxation on crude oil. The PAL on crude oil is 2.5% instead of 7.5% for a distillate like petrol and diesel, and they don't have to pay any duty. And this shows you what they produce and what they sell. So production as a share of sales shows you that, how much they refine and how much they sell. They also have other derivatives that come out like aviation fuel, on which they make a fair profit because they have a monopoly. But last year, because there was a significant reduction in aviation, that benefit was a lot lower. They also produce furnace oil which goes into power plants. Some of it is sold for bunkering. Next. And this is an appendix tabling that IMF document from 2010, which shows you corrective taxes. Next. So this was a short summary about setting the context. I did take a lot longer than I anticipated. So without further ado, let me start my conversation with a distinguished speaker from India, Dr. Narayan. Welcome, Dr. Narayan, to the program.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Maybe we can start. Thank you very much for finding the time today to join us. Maybe, Dr. Narayan, we can start by asking you a little bit about yourself. If you can introduce you to the audience, perhaps where in India do you come from? What did you study in school? What did you study in university? And what your career was like?
It becomes a bit of a long story, but okay, I'm speaking to you today from Chennai, which is my hometown. And I kind of grew up here and went to college and university here and started my life by, I did an MSc in physics here. And subsequently, I was at Cambridge. I did a MPhil in economics, development economics, and then I did a PhD in the Indian Institute of IIT in Delhi. So my area has been mostly development economics. But I worked in I joined the civil service of the government of India. It's called the Indian Administrative Service. And I worked in the state government, which is my own state, Tamil Nadu, for quite a few years, 10, 15 years. And then spent a lot of time in Delhi. And I was in many energy ministries. I started spending, in my younger time, I was in the ministries of coal and energy in Delhi, coal and power. And then subsequently, as I grew up and became a senior officer, I was posted as a secretary in the coal ministry, after that secretary in the petroleum ministry also. And went on then to the finance and economic affairs ministry and kind of ended my career as economic advisor to the prime minister. I ended my career in 2004. And after that, I have been a visiting fellow at the National University of Singapore for the last 14 or 15 years, where I write and I talk and I teach on areas which are related to energy in South Asia, as well as on public finance and public policy. So this is in very, very brief what I have been doing. Yeah.
It's a very distinguished career you have had, Dr. Narayan. What made you switch from physics to economics?
Sorry,
I said
you need to speak up just a little more.
Yes. What made you switch from physics to economics?
I think a lot of people have moved from physics to economics because it's natural. During the time that I was growing up, economics was I would say, not yet fully mathematical. It was still very much Adam Smith kind of books that we were talking about, Hugh Dalton, Adam Smith kind of books that we were talking about in public finance and macroeconomics. But it's only after the 60s, 70s that economics became an analytical science. And therefore, a lot of people who have done mathematics and especially physics found it very much easier get into the new discipline, which brought in their analytical skills there. So you have a lot of physics economics around the world now. Yeah.
So that's very interesting because one of Advocata's mission is to try to get more economic thinking in public policy. What is the current status quo in India? Do you think the general population understand economic thinking?
I do think, you see, what happens is because of the federal nature of the setup, a lot of policy making, especially economic policy making related to the external world and related to trade and commerce gets done in Delhi. So there is a concentration of economic thinkers as well as experts there. Mm-hmm. Whereas at the state level, it is much more at the state level. It's much more to do with, I would say, day-to-day fiscal policy in terms of managing budget sheets and also managing local taxes, especially taxes on from local bodies as well as the value-added taxes, etc. So I think the kind of expertise that you get at the state level is much more totally different than the state that you get at the national level.
Right, and you are a democracy. You are a federalist system. Do the politicians understand economic thinking? Because economics has been always said to be the dismal science, because there's always trade-offs and it's a science of scarcity. You can't satisfy everybody all the time. What has been your experience dealing with the political system in India?
I think we have been rather fortunate because we had an eminent economist like Dr. Manmohan Singh, first for several years as a finance minister, then for over 10 years as the prime minister. And we had Mr. Chidambaram, who is also understands, who is overseas educated. He understands economics and fiscal policy extremely well. And also we had in between Mr. Yashwant Sinha and others. So at least for the last 30, I would say more than 30 years, 30 to 40 years, we've been fortunate in having politicians who have also been very knowledgeable about finance as well as economics. So, and a lot of changes that have happened in the last 30 to 40 years are due to these people. So I think we have been fortunate. We were fortunate right at the beginning when we became independent in the early 50s or 60s. But then after that, I think the switchover or there was the kind of economists that were available in government. There was Mr. T.T. Krishnamachari for a while. But I would say we have been lucky. We have been overall lucky.
All right. Thank you very much for that. So, Dr. Narayan, if I can get to the topic at hand, since late, India has been taxing fuel. Your prices of petrol at 260, of course, is significantly higher than in Sri Lanka. But in the UK and the European Union, equivalent prices are something like 380 rupees. But it was not always so. You were not always taxing fuel at these much higher rates. Can you, for the benefit of our audience, take us through when this started changing and what the thought process was previously and what catalyzed the change?
Yeah, actually, as I talked to you over phone yesterday, it's a long story, and in order to understand the intricacies of fuel pricing in India as it stands today, it's very important to look at a bit of a history. And the history of fuel pricing actually goes back right up to the time of India's independence in the 50s. So if you recall at that particular time, after the partition, and the Bengal famine had happened only in the 30s and 40s. India was a largely agrarian economy, and India was also food deficit. It was not producing enough food for its own population, which was huge even by numbers, even at that time. So it was very, very important. The earliest governments between the 50s and the 60s, earliest government focused on increasing agriculture production and productivity. And one of because land holdings were small, and because the farmer had very outdated and antediluvian ways of cultivating the land, two big subsidies were started. And one subsidy, a major subsidy, was a subsidy for agriculture. And that subsidy came in the form of several inputs, a subsidy for seeds, for fertilizers, most importantly, subsidy for fuel. Fuel both in terms of petroleum, oil, and as well as for electricity. So at this particular point of time, what happened was that there was most of the country was not yet electrified, so there was a lot of irrigation requirement which happened and which could be done through pump sets. So there's no electricity, so the oil engine pump sets came in, and therefore there was diesel was priced. I used the term in my lecture saying there was a dieselization of the economy, which was caused by the factor that, okay, it was required for food production. And this dieselization of the economy extended to somehow sui generis, or extended into transportation. You had trucks running on diesel rather than petrol. You had locomotives running on diesel rather than petrol. So the production of diesel, the requirement of the production of diesel started growing much faster than the requirement of production of petrol, which became a transport fuel for cars, for the four-wheelers, and therefore was considered a more elite kind of a fuel. So the differential between the diesel prices and the petrol prices reflected, in a way, the political philosophy of the government, which said that, okay, the political philosophy is we will subsidize the poor man's fuel and we will charge the rich man's fuel at a high rate. So petrol and aviation fuel got charged at market prices, where diesel continuously is subsidized. To make this story complete, there was another fuel which was heavily subsidized, and that was kerosene. And kerosene was subsidized because kerosene, as you know, in the distillation process, kerosene is very close to aviation fuel. There's very little, I would say, hydrocarbon difference between the two. But kerosene was very, very, very heavily subsidized because it was considered the poor man's home cooking, home lighting fuel, especially since there was no electricity. Now, this dieselization had enormous consequences. Engineering industries started producing more diesel pump sets, more diesel engines. So, looking back at 50, 60 years, whether it was the right way to go is often a question, because diesel is not such an efficient fuel as petrol in terms of combustion, in terms of, I would say, environmental requirements, etc. So for many, many years, right up to the 70s, until the first oil shock, I'm sorry I'm being a little verbose because it's very difficult.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Very difficult to understand otherwise. So until the first oil shock in 1971, the first oil shock in 1971, diesel was heavily subsidized. Government had all the refining capacity. The refineries were producing more diesel. In fact, the refineries, even now, the refineries are constructed in a way that 50 to 55% of the production is diesel. which is very different from refineries, maybe let's say in the modern world, where the production is much more on the higher value, on the higher distillation fuels. So, but in 1971 was a shock. There was another shock in 1973, and another shock in I think 1973 was the first shock. Then 1991, when we realized that the prices were suddenly double and treble. And therefore, government had to take a policy decision, okay, what is to do? We were not yet out of the woods in terms of agriculture production. Today we have surplus in terms of cereal production. Actually, it's kind of the food stocks are coming out of our ears now. I mean, even with a population which has grown 3 times, we just don't know what to do with the food stocks. They're giving it away in public distribution shops. They're giving it away free, etc. Because there's too much of cereal getting produced now. So, but at that particular times, we are not yet food self-sufficient. So the diesel subsidy had to continue. We are not yet electricity sufficient. Therefore, kerosene subsidy had to continue both for lighting in the villages as well as for the village for fuel needs. And therefore, the prices of petrol kept going up and up. Petrol and aviation fuel kept going up, and still the oil companies continue to make losses and didn't make profits at all.
And what was
these were covered by subsidies.
What was the reason why they were making losses?
Because as I said, because of the dieselization of the economy, if you are spending 55 to 60% of your product, your manufacturing, and selling at below cost, because diesel is a subsidized fuel.
So when you say that,
that's very difficult for. There were refineries at that time which were producing only 7% in petrol and only about 3.5% in aviation fuel. So it's very difficult for the cost of the 10% to make up for the costs of the loss in costs of the 55%.
So the diesel basically, was there taxes on diesel, and it was part of it was borne by the oil company selling at a loss? Or when you say
prior to, I will come to 1990, because we had a major change in economic policies in 1991.
Okay.
So I will come to that later.
Okay.
But in the earlier years, the kind of losses, the kind of differential used to be just provided as subsidies to the oil company.
So you mean at those earlier years, the government didn't tax petrol and diesel?
No, they did tax, but the states also used to tax. But those taxes, when you talked about the numbers that you came up with today, those taxes were very, very much more, I would say, benign, very much more benign compared to the tax burden which is being levied on the oil products as of today.
So
and we'll come to why and what and the distribution.
So let me stop you here. So what was happening there, because a similar thing is happening, was the government was imposing much smaller taxes. The oil companies were paying the taxes, but they were being forced to sell at a price lower than their total cost.
I would say the pump price was fixed.
Right.
And when the pump price was fixed, you must also remember that for quite some time, until the refinery capacity really came on stream until the early 90s, there was also import of fuel which is happening.
Okay.
Today it's a reverse. We have a surplus of refining capacity,
right,
and therefore a lot of crude oil import costs are being balanced out by product exports.
Okay.
And we make a lot of money. I mean, in fact, oil product exports is one of a major export commodity out of India now. And this is just value addition coming out of importing coal and importing crude and refining it better. But okay, so if we skip this period and then we come to the post 1990, we come to the late 80s, 1990 period. There was something called, the government introduced because the consumption started growing, and as the consumption started growing, the ability of the oil companies to manage their balance sheets, as well as the ability of the government to provide continuous subsidies to the oil companies, started declining. So they came up with a different system called an administered price mechanism. The administered price mechanism pooled together the refining capacity of all the refineries, pulled together the cost of imported oil as well as imported products, came up with an equated price in terms of each of the products, decided the kind of subsidies that would be given to the products, and this differential, to the extent that I would say it was always a political decision, political economic decision, to the extent that this could be absorbed by the higher value fuels, particularly the aviation fuel and petrol fuels, whose consumption had by now ballooned substantially. It was passed on, and then the balance was put into what is called an APM, the pricing mechanism fund. And this fund, the oil companies could, because they didn't want to be short of the money. So these companies could issue bonds in the market, and these bonds were long duration bonds, 10-year, 20-year bonds. And because they were not really sovereign, but the oil companies were sovereign entities by themselves. So the bonds got traded in the market, the oil companies got money, and a lot of those long duration bonds are coming up for maturity now between 2021 and 2026. So the government will shell out the money. So they are actually paying in the next 5 years for the kind of subsidies that they did not pay 20 years back or 30 years back. Mm-hmm. So this was a mechanism that was introduced. And simultaneously, gradual increases of price started taking place. Gradual increase of price of diesel, gradual increase of price of petrol, and even the most politically difficult thing was the kerosene. But by this time, most state governments were already electrifying all the villages. So what happened was that most state governments decided to give free electricity, domestic electricity, to the villages, which relieved a lot of pressure on kerosene. And once you relieved the pressure on kerosene, it was easy to start increasing the prices of kerosene also. So these changes happened between 1990 and 2000. And by about 2002, when the prices, international oil prices, fell substantially, government freed up the market and said oil companies can now charge the market price for all the products. And then the government also started raking in quite a bit of money in terms of taxes, in terms of central excise and taxes. Central excise itself is a 1990, I think started very small in the early 1990s. I can't tell you the year exactly, but early 1990s, just about 2%. And it went up to about 16, 17, 18% by about 2010 or so. So government started making money out of the oil companies because the oil prices were benign for a substantial period of time. But oil prices have been going up and down, up and down. So at the back of the mind is always the political economy saying, which is the sector which we want to protect, which is the sector we want to subsidize, and how is it that we make the entire ecosystem benign in terms of financial requirements. So this is the overall story. Now what has happened is something totally different. That is post, I would say, 2012, when oil prices went up to $130, $140. Now it came down, of course, to $35, $40 of crude, then has gone up to $60 to $70. It is no longer possible to do this time lag balancing of subsidy requirement, because oil companies work on a day-to-day basis. Their balance sheet working capital requirements are on a day-to-day basis. And it's not possible to say, I will calculate at the end of the year and give you a subsidy or give you a bond, because meanwhile they would be starved of funds. And therefore, The prices were in 2014, the prices are actually totally, first it was done in 2003, 2004, but then the prices went up so as they had to bring back subsidies. But then it was totally opened up in 2014 to say, okay, now they are market related prices. The oil companies can charge market related prices for all products. And even for household, I would say the cooking gas, you can charge whatever. But if at all we want to subsidize, we will subsidize in a targeted manner. We will target the poorest of the households for subsidizing domestic gas. And that is happening. There's something called the Ujjwala scheme where the people below the poverty line are actually given a gas cylinder more or less free at very, very low cost every other month or so. So the subsidy burden has come down substantially. Now let us look at the revenue side of it. The revenue side of it, now, okay, another requirements came up. Now, as the prices went up, as the economy started growing, as the requirement for agriculture for oil engine pumps had decreased, as the electricity generation improved, okay, there was a gradual shift towards greater and greater petrol consumption. That is also the time the motor vehicles, the four-wheelers started coming in. You had lorries and trucks which are also petrol driven. As petrol become the, I would say, the middle class fuel and the more desired fuel, then it was possible for the government to extract some of the surpluses in terms of excise duty for its own budgetary requirements. And therefore, the excise duty slowly went up to about 18% on the fuel prior to GST coming in. And the state government said, okay, finally, we are selling it at the petrol bunks which are available in our state. So let us add a local sales tax component to it also. So by the time the GST came in 2017, already the oil consumer or the petrol consumer was paying about 24 to 25% of the cost as taxes. But however, there was still a big differential between the petrol price and the diesel price. So this is a story up to then. So I pause. Then I'll take it up further.
Thank you, Dr. Narayan, for that exhaustive analysis of what happened in India. There are many topics I would like to explore, but since about 2012, the quantum of taxes has been significantly increased. As I explained that relatively, of course, it's not as high as, say, countries in the European Union, but you are taxing significantly higher. So India, like Sri Lanka, is a democracy, it's noisy, the politicians perhaps are not the most erudite or educated, so there would have been a lot of noise, political noise and debate about affordability and the poor. Can you explain to us what catalyzed that significant increase in taxation after 2012 and how the political economy worked and how the political narrative played out?
I think in a way that is, I would say, one followed the other. By the time you are in 2012, or I would say in 2014, 3 or 4 factors have already happened. One is that the middle class has grown considerably. So aspirations of having a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler have grown enormously. So for example, in Chennai where I live, the largest Chennai has about 8 million population. And of the 8 million population, probably there are about 3.5 to 4 million two-wheelers and close to 1 million cars which are running around. So it's become an aspiration requirement. And once you have an aspiration requirement, the price elasticity drops. The demand becomes considerably more inelastic. Government realized this. And they said, okay, if it's an inelastic demand, then in that case I can certainly increase the prices without affecting the total demand. So, okay, this is from the consumer point of view. From the other point of view, most state governments as well as the central government started giving more and more subsidies and I would say welfare benefits to the poor, especially in the names of in the public distribution system in terms of wheat and rice, which was easy to give, but also actually old age pensions and cash doles, etc. So there was a huge pool of welfare outflow which was happening, and this welfare outflow had to be funded. There has to be some fund for this, and therefore, as the consumption of the oil consumption grew up, it was obvious for both the state governments as well as the center government that here was an opportunity for taxing these categories. And therefore, while the costs of oil prices, oil at the petrol bank end went up, simultaneously on the other side, some welfare benefit was also happening. So in a way, there was, I would say, a political balance between social welfare, equity, and also, okay, it's only the car owning and the motorcycle owning people who are having to pay more, but a person who walks on the street and the person who goes by bicycle, he gets a benefit of free rations and free food and free education and free textbook. So all right, so there was a kind of an equity concept is something that the politician could sell to his constituents.
Okay.
And therefore, sorry, go ahead.
So thank you for that clarification. Let me probe you a little bit more. I mean, another very successful thing that India has done is the subsidy mechanism itself. I mean, any student of economics is taught that allocation and distribution are two fundamentally different things. So has India moved away from the price being used as a tool of equity and distribution to cash transfers or direct transfers to the needy? What happened in that subsidy scheme?
As of now, there are no subsidies for petroleum and petroleum products. They are charged by in fact, it's the reverse. Government keeps increasing the excise levies on the petroleum, especially in the last 2 years. They have said we have such a huge expenditure out of medical and COVIDs and vaccine, etc. And therefore, we don't have that kind of increase in revenues because there has been a contraction in the GDP growth, and therefore we are just putting it back on petrol. I'm sorry, on fuel.
I mean, in my research for today's event, I saw a statistic that in India, the excise duty, maybe at the central government level, used to account about 5.5% of total taxes, and now it has gone up to about 12%.
12%. You're right.
So that's at the central government level, right?
Yes, and this is what today, and especially in the last 5 or 6 months, there have been repeated increases not only in prices, but repeated increases in levies. And many state governments and all opposition parties are up in arms today. Even if as we are conversing, are up in arms against this, saying, how can you do this? To which again say, currently the central government is replying, saying, I have these extra costs. I have these COVID-related costs. And these costs relate to supplying free vaccination for, I would say, 1.3 billion, 130 crores worth of people. I have to supply. I have medical requirement costs. And I don't have that kind of revenue generation happening out of the economy. And therefore, I am doing this is a justification. But this is a battle. This is a political battle, politico-economic battle that is going on currently. So whether this kind of taxation is sustainable or whether this kind of taxation, they will have to bring it down once the pandemic is over and these costs actually subside, is something we'll have to see as we play on as we go forward.
So, Dr. Narayan, I also noted that if you look at the taxation, it's like 50% of the tax goes to the central government and about 50% goes to the state government. Of course, all state governments are not the same. Some, Maharashtra, I believe, has the highest amount of taxes. You all use a VAT, but your general sales tax system in India is the GST. Why didn't you use the GST system for fuel, and why a VAT?
Okay. This is the GST. If you understand the GST system, which was introduced in 2007, petroleum products were kept out of GST. The reason petroleum products were kept out of GST is that the state governments wanted a flexibility. You see, once the GST system comes into place, the flexibility of the state governments to charge a sales tax on any particular good, let's say a cigarette or liquor, etc., goes away. The GST system is an all-India system, subsumes it, it has input, credit, output, etc., etc.
So, are you saying
Petroleum
that the GST goes into a common pot and it's reallocated?
Common pot and it's distributed.
And
There's
the VAT is collected at the state level?
Yeah. So, the GST Council, which consists of all the states together as well as the center, decided to keep petroleum out of it because they wanted some flexibility at the state level to be able to tax petroleum products in order to gain revenue for themselves. And therefore, there's a state tax in the petroleum. And the there's also a central excise in petroleum, which goes to the center. But what goes to the center is again shared back to the state. What is gained by the states remains in the state. So what the center has now tried to do is to start levying, instead of taxes on energy products, it levies what are called cesses. Cesses under the Constitution are not distributable. The center can keep it for itself. And this is again a matter of huge political debate with opposition parties complaining that you are keeping on cesses because you want to deny money to the states. So again, this is a big battle, political battle that is going on at the moment.
So, Dr. Narayan, if I was just to probe on a question that was not answered previously, maybe you misunderstood me. When I mean the general welfare system in India, I believe that you all have moved towards a cash transfer system instead of using pricing mechanisms for all the products and services you want to subsidize. So, using the Aadhaar program, that you all are focusing more on transferring cash to the needy and allowing market prices to remain what they are. Can you comment a little bit about that?
No, this is good. This is very good. This is something which has happened in the last 5 years. And the move was that, okay, first is to create a bank account for everybody who has a card holder, a ration card holder, or Aadhaar card holder. And there was a drive to the public sector banks to really make sure that everybody had a bank account. And surprisingly, they were allowed to open a bank account with, kind of zero credit, because the bank account was not for them to put in money, but to take out the subsidies. Once the bank account is there and once the Aadhaar card is in position, it is very easy to link and to directly transfer funds to the individuals. You save the mechanism of processing at the state level. You save the mechanism of any leakages that may happen, institutional leakages that may happen, and the entire money can pass on. So this has worked extremely well. Now everybody, I get a pension, so I don't have to go anywhere. It just hits my bank account.
So if you take the total population and you take the total proportion of families, what proportion benefits from these cash transfer schemes?
Cash transfers are targeted. Cash transfers are targeted to, for example, because it differs in a way state to state. Let us take this state. This state has, has 2.2, rather 22 million ration cards, this state. Now they have given out in the last few years 3 colored cards. I mean, kind of a white card, a yellow card, and green card. Now the green card is for the poorest people. They get all the cash transfer subsidies. You need to have a green card and a green card number, and this is digitized. When I say a card, actually it's a chip-based, like a credit card kind of thing, which you need, which is in the central registry. So the money transfer, the product transfer, everything happens for that. You get the next level. You don't get some of those benefits at all. You don't get free rice. You don't get free sugar, but you can buy. You can buy rice and sugar at the predetermined prices there. Then you get the next level. At the next level, you hardly get anything. But yeah, okay. Occasionally, they may be supplying things which are not available, like wheat or oil or something like that, which you can go and buy. So once you have targeted subsidies, it is very easy to transfer benefits directly to the targeted beneficiary. Just now, in Tamil Nadu state, the new government has announced a 2,000 rupee cash, COVID cash for all people who are below a particular line. And everybody, including let's say my driver or people working at home, they've been able to draw that money along with a bag of rice and a bag of wheat and a bag of whatever. Whereas, I as an owner would not get it.
This is an absolute amount of cash that is transferred. Now, you mentioned something about...
Absolute amount of cash that is transferred.
Yes.
Correct.
So if, for example, they want to give you a subsidy, say, for very high fuel prices, are you given just the absolute amount of cash, or you will get discount?
No. So this is. I mean, I'm talking of general cash transfers, including old age benefits, including pensions, etc. I'm talking of. But for the let us say cooking gas, for example, cooking gas. The cooking gas distributor charges a subsidized price for, see, if I pay 700 to 800 rupees for a cooking gas cylinder, then a cooking gas for the next level of subsidy would be something like 190 to 200 rupees. And for people who are declared below the poverty line, it is free. And the distributor then bills that to the oil company, and the oil company finally, equates it. Finally, I am, at the end of the story, suddenly I am paying for that free this thing as well. It is included in my price in terms of, I would say, a social cost. So far as the oil company is concerned, it is recovering full cost for all the cylinders that it supplies.
So for these non-commercial obligations, how does the government do it? Do they annually transfer a subsidy, or how does the mechanism?
Yeah, all subsidies are budgetary transfers. When you use the word subsidy, budgetary transfers, the complaint of the companies, including the food corporation, fertilizer corporation, is that the transfers don't happen on time. In the sense that if the government is in a budgetarily in a tight position, they postpone these subsidy transfers. And as you postpone the subsidy transfers, then these corporations have to borrow from the banks for the working capital, and that is an additional cost to their operation. This is the complaint. But otherwise, all budget. For example, this is because I have myself done 4 budgets, but this is the first budget that I would say at least in the last 25, 30 years, where all subsidies are transparently provided in the budget document itself to say, this is the subsidy, this is the amount that is due that we have not been able to pay. Okay, so accumulated subsidies as well as current transfers are all reflected in a public document.
So, with regard to the subsidy for diesel and petrol, there is no subsidy given. No subsidy.
Market prices.
Market price. Okay, if I can move on.
But one of the huge taxation. Taxation is on top of the price. Yeah.
Okay. One of the questions that came from the audience is that when you start taxing and you have world market prices going up, it will feed into inflation, either through first order or second order effects. How has India thought about that?
You know, this is starting to become a problem now. You see, when okay, look at the positives of I would say the COVID in the last 14-15 months. The positives of the COVID has been that the demand has been low. Supply has not contracted, especially agriculture supply, food supply, vegetable supply, milk supply has not contracted to the extent that the demand has contracted. And therefore inflation has been, particularly food price inflation has been extremely low. So if food price inflation low and there's a lockout throughout the country, then the transportation costs also come down. But they're starting to face a problem now. You will see that the Reserve Bank of India, even last week, has flagged this issue saying that, okay, fuel prices are transmitting themselves into consumer prices and they are transmitting themselves into as well as the wholesale price index. And it's already crossing about 5.5% and slowly becoming unacceptable. So yes, this is going to be a problem as we go forward from now for the next few months. Going to be a serious problem because on the one hand, if a third wave of the COVID comes, then government still requires a lot of resources.
Okay. So and if I was to summarize what you said, that I'm presuming in the Indian inflation basket that food has a large weightage, and due to COVID, basically prices have been under check, and therefore higher fuel prices could be absorbed. So when the world market...
One additional point, we had a bumper crop of all products for the last 2 years, and we probably will have a huge agricultural production this year also. So there's a large supply and a soft demand.
Okay. The next question, Dr. Narayan, is that, with regard to the states, how important is the VAT taxes on fuel as a percentage of their total state taxes besides transfers from the central government? Is it a large component?
I can't give you a number offhand on that, because most states now rely on the central stances, and the liquor is something that they can tax, the states can tax for themselves. And the liquor is another fairly inelastic demand. So therefore those taxes have been going up. So as we speak, even for Tamil Nadu, I could not give you a percentage, but it's significant. They can't lower the tax because states' demands in terms of welfare and other distributional requirements are also going up. They can't lower their taxes at the moment.
Okay. India also liberalized its petroleum industry. I mean, your biggest private company, Reliance, size is mainly due to its own refineries. I don't know whether they are allowed retailing, petroleum retailing. I think SR...
Yeah, they are retailing.
They have a...
They are retailing.
Can you tell us a little bit about when that reform happened in the whole petroleum sector to allow private players, and whether competition, what that has been meant for your industry?
It's happened right from 1991 onwards when the reform process started. Private companies were allowed to come into refinery market even towards the end of the 80s. And the Reliance Petroleum refinery got set up, I think, early 90s, and they expanded, became big in 1995. Other refineries like SR and other things came in. But Reliance is today a very big refinery, a very, very modern refinery. We don't have anybody else of that size or quality at the moment. But retailing, marketing of oil product, That came much later. That came post, I would say, when I was there, it had started. It had came 98, 99 onwards, they were allowed to open retail outlets. But retail outlet at that time, remember, the price was still a fixed price, administered price. And therefore, many of the private players did not choose to do so because even Shell came in, BP came in, etc. They didn't like the administered price mechanism. They opened a few retail bunks. They decided it was not worth their while. But now, subsequently, once the prices were freed after 2004 and again after 2012, then you have a large number of private players.
Okay. Dr. Narayan, there is a specific question to you. One of our people on the audience has read one of your books. It says, I read in your book chapter that even after liberalization, government keeps on intervening in the diesel market. When did this stop and how?
In the, sorry, which market?
In the diesel market. Somebody has read your book and in one chapter you have
Which book?
I'm not sure. He didn't say which book. But you say that the whole market was liberalized since 2012, right? It was a complete market price mechanism.
Right.
Right. So maybe that's the answer. That
no, yeah. There was a short period. There was a short period just prior to the 2014 elections, as well as prior to the 2019 elections. There was a big window when the oil companies were asked to stop increasing prices as per market prices and asked to put it on hold. Now that's a bit of a, in physics terms, that's a bit of a singularity. Okay, that's a bit of a singularity in the sense that the money that they lost for those 5 or 6 months during two big elections, nobody has really talked about. Where is it? I mean, government has not come up with the subsidy. They said that, please, we are going in for an election. Don't mess up the electorate. So therefore, don't increase the prices until the elections are over. All right, fine. Because the oil companies are substantially public sector owned, they obeyed the rules. But then what happens to the loss? Nobody wants to talk about it at the moment. So that's what I was mentioning, the intervention.
Another topic that I want to explore, Dr. Narayan, is in Sri Lanka, as I showed, we tax fuel, at a very low level. But we tax cars at very high levels, 100%, 200%, sometimes even 300%. And because diesel is sold at a lower price, we try to do some correction by taxing diesel engines at even higher prices. Can you give us how India taxes cars, personal cars and vehicles, and what the thought process has been?
Oh, you see, this is one good thing that has happened in the last few years, that the differential between diesel and petrol has gradually reduced. And today, it's, I would say, almost 100 to 95 or 92. Almost they are very, very close to each other. Okay, as a person who spent a lot of years in the energy industry, I think this is an excellent thing that has happened. Because I do feel that in terms of actual combustion efficiency, petrol has much better combustion efficiency than a diesel engine. All right. And therefore, slowly going away from this overwhelming dependence on diesel has been a very, very good thing for the economy. And slowly our refineries are also adjusting to this increasing demand. And I think this is a direction that Sri Lanka should take also. Reduce this, because fuel is fuel. And finally, you are looking at, therefore, once you make all fuels similar, then you can concentrate on fuel efficiency from the combustion, from the engineering and the mechanical engineering side, rather than purely from the fuel injection side. So you can change the nature of the kind of, and also you can improve emission standards once you are not choosing a cheaper fuel you're not choosing a more polluting fuel just because it's cheaper. So I think this kind of I would say this price liberalization will have lot of improvements in the economy, downstream benefits to the economy, especially on the manufacturing side.
So Dr. Narayan, can you comment if you remember how you tax cars? So for example, you have a GST, I believe, on cars and some other taxes. Do you have offhand what the tax burden is on if you buy a new vehicle?
Cars are covered under GST. I think it's a standard rate of 18% on all vehicles manufactured, except for large vehicles. Anything over 4 meters, that is a big SUVs and all that, the tax rate is 28%. They are the more upper end.
So there is 18%, and is there an excise duty on cars?
No. 18% full stop.
That's it. So,
and that 18% is a total tax, and that is a GST that is finally shared between the center and the states on the basis of decisions of the GST Council.
So just to give you a context, in Sri Lanka, we used to spend about $1 billion on vehicle imports, but our net import bill on fuel was about $3.5 billion. And we were taxing cars basically at 100%, 200%, 300%, but taxing fuel at 10%, 20%, etc. Or even in the case of petrol as high as 40%. So it's a completely skewed system to what's there in India. So in India, basically, you have very relatively low taxes on vehicles, but very high taxes on fuel.
Not quite so, because you must understand that over 90% of the vehicle population is indigenously produced. Mm-hmm. So this problem that you have is not, it was a problem, maybe have been a problem for us about 20, 30, 40 years ago. But now the imported vehicles are usually fairly high-end vehicles like a BMW or even Benz is been manufactured here. So then all vehicles, because they are locally produced, face the same kind of taxation.
Okay, so it's
big vehicles taxed 28%, small ones 18%, full stop.
Okay, so basically the policy thinking is that because you want to keep it affordable, because you want to stimulate the domestic industry, the production side.
Yeah, okay. That is right. It is one of the biggest industries. The engineering industry, automotive manufacturing is one of the biggest industries because it has spawned so many ancillary industries, employments, the small and medium industries. It has spawned industries in forgings, in castings, in electronics, in making airbags and seat belts and whatnot. So it's a huge multiplier.
Okay.
It's a very huge multiplier. Therefore, at all stages of this entire chain, right from tires up to engines, the tax is fixed at 18%, full stop.
Dr. Narayan, I spoke about corrective taxes. Now, a government can decide what to tax. Fuel is just one product. I mean, tobacco and alcohol is another easy product to tax. Now, these very high taxes that have been imposed on fuel, was there some economic analysis and thinking that because there are externalities that we can justify corrective taxes? Or was the thinking more on the fiscal side that we need revenue and this is an easy source to tax?
You see, India has a substantial manufacturing base as well as a consumption base and a demand base. So both supply and demand are indigenous. So the pressure of externalities for an economy like India is considerably less than for a country like Sri Lanka. And therefore, it is much more the indigenous considerations of, let's say, promoting sectors of industry and promoting sectors of the economy, which I would call it not just an economic, but a politico-economic kind of a decision. Mm-hmm. which determines all this, and therefore externalities therefore fade into the background.
Finally, I mean, because we are running out of time, if I can just explore one or two further topics. Now, what is the current thinking amongst policymakers about fuel taxes? Is this very well anchored in Indian society that fuel taxes are here to stay?
I think two or three things will happen. I don't think this rate of high taxation on petroleum products, which is being excused because of the pandemic which is raging, I don't think this can continue forever. And the second thing which will happen is that if inflation goes up, government gets into very deep trouble. It gets into deep trouble not through for just the price mechanism, but also through, because the government is also a supplier in the sense that it builds a lot of infrastructure. It builds a lot of development. It has a lot of development expenditure. So its own costs go up. Okay, all the state governments and the central government borrow a lot from the market. Borrowing costs go up. And therefore, to keep up this high level of taxation is going to be extremely difficult, particularly as inflationary pressures are increasing. They may do it for a short period of time if the pandemic repeats itself, but I don't think it can happen. There's a lot of demand to bring the petroleum product under GST, even at a high level, because even if they bring in at the highest level of 28%, still it will be far lower than what's happening now. And then it becomes extremely transparent. What is being transferred to the state and the center becomes transparent. And that will happen. That may not happen overnight, but that will happen as we go forward. And that will be very good for the consumer, because then the prices would stabilize based on international market prices.
Okay. And the final question I would like to explore is that electrification seems like it's here to stay. And I believe that India also has announced a policy that from 2030, it will only produce electric cars. And I read somewhere that, if you look at the trade in oil, it is the largest trade in oil. I think it totals about $1 trillion globally. But on top of that, there's a huge amount of taxes also collected globally, taxes based on petroleum. Now, if you assume that in the next 10 to 15 years, this electrification wave is here to stay and a significant amount of transformation will happen, it's going to have, and I've heard a Chinese company is able to engineer cars even cheaper because they're less complicated, they have less parts, etc. So what's your thinking? I mean, if petroleum usage is going to start reducing, and basically the fuel source turns into electricity, which probably can be driven by renewables, if we crack the storage problem, how would you as an economist think about it? I mean, some other form of revenue will have to be found.
Actually, I see some little bit different problems to electrification. For example, take the shipping industry. Take airlines. I don't see how they can move away from fossil fuels. At least, certainly not in our lifetime. I don't see natural gas airplanes, or I don't see natural gas ships running around. I look at the defense, which is a substantial amount of, I don't see tanks and artilleries running on solar power. So, when we talk of electrification, we are primarily talking of personal transportation. Even commercial vehicle electrification is a bit further away. So it's only a pocket of the energy consumption that is going to get electrified in the next 10 to 15 years. And when you segment it like this, then the problems of storage as well as the engine train become very much more manageable than if you say I'm going to electrify I am going to take totally off fossil fuels. I don't think that would happen, certainly not in my lifetime, perhaps not in yours, particularly because of the things I mentioned.
Okay, thank you for that. We have come to the end of our time today. Maybe there is some parting wisdom or parting comment. Dr. Narayan, I gave you an introduction of the challenges that we have in Sri Lanka and how our system is very different to India. Is there some words of advice that you would like to give us?
No, I do think if I were to look from the finance point of view there, I do think one should look at what is this price increase happening for? Is it happening in order just for fiscal consideration? Or is this happening in order to balance out some kind of, I would definitely say, welfare expenditure, which otherwise would not happen? Not government defense expenditure or infrastructure expenditure. But if there is a balancing welfare expenditure that happens, that mitigates, people would understand it very much more. But if it's merely for I would say, balance sheet support, and I don't think that's a good way to go.
Okay, thank you. What happens in Sri Lanka is because we have tax subsidies and because the richer households are the main consumers, actually we are subsidizing the rich. So we have to at least try to reduce that before we have a welfare discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Narayan, for the time. It has been a pleasure having you on today's program.
Thank you.
Take care and stay safe.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.